Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my right honourable friend for his answer. But one of the main drivers of immigration over the last 20 years, labour shortages caused by falling birth rate and insufficient working age population. So I ask what discussions my right honourable friend has had with colleagues in the Treasury about this issue, and does he agree that the government must have a strategy to address falling?
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend makes about birth rates, and I have to concede. But I have spoken with my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, tips and lifelong learning. We want to be a high-skilled, high-income economy rather than a low-skilled mass migration economy. That remains the government's priority, and we are taking action in our immigration policy to reflect that.
Mr Speaker, Tekla Haimanot Tesfaye is one of the elite female cyclists chosen to lead Ride London next month. She's also an asylum seeker living in a hotel in my constituency where the food is so bad it makes her sick and unable to compete. Last month, an investigation found food for asylum seekers that was undercooked, past its sell-by date and infested with insects, and left them in some cases in hospital, and the responsibility of its contractor Clear Springs, so asylum seekers like Tahas are not subject to such dangerous and degrading conditions.
Home Secretary.
Mr Speaker, I can assure you, the honourable gentleman in the House, that our contractors are expected to maintain standards. Where they fall below those standards, they will be held to account, and I will absolutely take a note of the case that he has raised.
Gilly Tolhurst.
Oh, thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the measures my right honourable friend has taken to tackle the levels of legal migration. But could my right honourable friend inform me if what assessment he has made of the expected impact of the new immigration salary list and what that will have on the net migration figure?
Secretary.
My honourable friend is at the front line of our fight against illegal migration, but legal migration is important. We have recognised that the figures have been too high in the most recent couple of years for a number of reasons, and we have taken, as I've listed, we have taken a number of measures. That is that, by our estimations, 300,000 people who would have previously have been eligible under the new regime that I have put in place will no longer be eligible, and that's the order of magnitude of change that we will eventually see once these proposals are fully implemented.
Tim Farrell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The refusal to allow care workers from overseas to bring a spouse with them comes at the same time as in Cumbria we're finding it impossible to fill at least a fifth of all the social care jobs. Would you explain to constituents of mine who are incapable or unable to find those people to care for them and their loved ones why it seems sensible to make people from overseas lives so miserable in coming over here to care for our loved ones they don't come at all?
Home Secretary.
Mr Speaker, I recognise in rural communities that recruitment and retention of staff is difficult, and in his constituency, which is a wonderful, beautiful but very rural constituency, there are particular pressures. I can assure him the global supply of potential care workers is very, very significant, and actually the issues with regard to where in the country those people work are more about the internal dynamic within the UK economy than the quantum of people around the world who would seek to work in the UK. There are plenty of people who would wish to work here, recognising that they are not allowed to bring their dependents with them. But the issue of where in the country those people work is actually a broader issue.
SNP spokesperson Alison Thewlis.
The cruel Conservative hikes to the visa minimum income threshold have caused deep distress, deep distress to many. Does he understand the pain that these changes have caused? And what message does he believe it sends out to those that would do us the honour of making their home in these islands, that he puts such a high price on love and family life?
Secretary.
Mr Speaker, it is absolutely right that any nation in the world puts conditionality on the people it accepts within its own borders. This country has a long-standing, in fact, I'm a product of this, as are my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, the Trade Secretary, and many others within the government, of a long-standing tradition in this country of being open and welcoming. However, when we see the orders of magnitude of legal migration that we've seen over the last couple of years, it is incumbent upon us to take action. We have made it clear what action we'll take. We have given notice of the changes so that people can make their plans accordingly. And when there are special cases, there is a special cases exemption so that we can both control immigration and do our moral duty to protect those people who seek our protection and be an attractive place for people to come and work.
Kim Johnson.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 2020, we have supported 413 projects through our Safer Streets Fund and also the Safety of Women at Night Fund, investing over £150 million, including £3.9 million, which has been designated to Merseyside. The objective of the fund is to improve public protection, particularly that of women, particularly at night. An independent evaluation shows that it is more than achieving its objective.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, but I don't really think the Minister answered the question about the impact on the reduction. Merseyside has now received a combined reduction of £180,000 to our Safer Streets Fund in round 5. And our Police and Crime Commissioner, Emily Spurrell, has called this ill-considered and short-sighted because projects have already begun and delivery is underway, but the funding has been restricted yet again. So will the Minister agree today to reinstate the lost funding so that Merseyside Police and others can continue their great work keeping our streets safe?
Minister.
May I just gently tell the Honourable Lady that in the last round of funding, round 4, the Merseyside received £1.3 million through the Safer Streets Fund. That was quadruple what it had received in round 3. And over £1 million of this was designated specifically into CCTV and street lighting in Liverpool city centre. Round 5 should be seen in the context of record funding into the Merseyside Police, who received an unprecedented uplift of £27.6 million, a 6.5% uplift. I am confident that Merseyside will still be able to deliver its schemes, including the Safe Homes cards, providing safe transport to help women get home from night spots in this round.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Essex, the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner Roger Hurst has used the Safer Streets money to pay for CCTV and safety measures in the bunny walks, to pay for safety improvements around the Chelmsford prison to keep residents safe, and also more recently for CCTV cameras in Central Park and the avenues and extra safety measures around the cathedral. Despite all this, the local Lib Dems want to take credit for all of Roger's work. So will the Home Secretary pop down to Chelmsford to come and see me and Roger and make sure that we say thank you to Roger for all he's done with his government money to keep people safe?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. She is correct. Roger Hurst has an exceptional track record as a Police and Crime Commissioner. He's done outstanding work driving down antisocial behaviour and domestic burglary. And the examples she gives are exactly what the Safer Streets Fund is for. Bespoke, local, dedicated services that will improve public protection. I know that the Essex Police have higher numbers than at any point in their 185-year history, and I will certainly urge the Home Secretary to pay them a visit at the next available opportunity.
Shadow Minister Alex Davis-Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on behalf of the whole Shadow Home Affairs team, can I please place on record our sincere condolences on the loss of your father. Mr. Speaker, following the horrific killing of Kulsuma Akhtar in Bradford, who was tragically stabbed to death in broad daylight while pushing her 3-year-old son in a pram, West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester Police have referred themselves for investigation because of prior contact with Kulsuma and her husband, who has since been arrested for her murder. Cases of multiple contact with the police before violent escalation are all too common. Labour will mandate domestic abuse and wider violence against women and girls training for every police officer in the country, and we'll introduce Raneem's law to overhaul the policing response when reports are first made. So I ask the Minister, how many more women will have to die before the government can do the same?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady is right to mention the case of Osama Akhtar. It is appalling what happened to her. I obviously can't comment on any specifics in relation to the case, but she will know that the bail conditions that the perpetrator had been released under contained restrictions that were breached themselves. So it was not a case of the court refusing to apply conditions, it is that he breached them. In relation to her wider point, of course, every single one of these cases is a tragedy. She will know, because we've worked on a cross-party basis in the past, how much time and attention we dedicate to this at the Home Office. But I will simply say this. We now have domestic abuse training that has been rolled out to over 80% of forces. The Home Secretary and I are working very, very closely with the 9 outstanding ones. They are on a timetable for delivery. I want to reassure her of that. And we now, this month, have specialist trained rape specialists in every single police force in England and Wales.
Tim Law.
Number 3, sir.
Minister.
Thank you. Look, I thank my right honourable friend enormously for raising this question. Let me be quite clear that the hostile activity we've seen from Chinese authorities and state-affiliated groups poses a serious threat to the security and well-being of the British people and to our partners and allies across the world. The Deputy Prime Minister came to this chamber last month to speak about the pattern of malign activity, including the targeting of our parliamentarians and 2 malicious cyber campaigns by Chinese state-affiliated actors. We must never be afraid to stand up for ourselves and to call out this kind of activity that has targeted both him and me.
Tim Law.
Mr. Speaker, can I add my personal condolences for your father's losses as well? Can I say to my right honourable friend that, of course, we had the scandal about the hacking of MPs' email accounts back in March. We subsequently learned that the FBI had informed our government about this instance 2 years ago, as well as other foreign governments who had legislators who were also affected. Why has it taken 2 years for us to be told about a serious security breach? And will he now, with his colleagues in Cabinet, make sure that China is absolutely treated as and labelled as a threat and not just an epoch-defining systemic challenge, and everything is done urgently to put China in the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme?
Minister.
My right honourable friend, who's given this House and our country exceptional service over many years and will sadly be standing down in the next election, has made, again, some very, very strong points. The first of which is that he knows the language that I use and he's heard the words that I've said. The reality is that we face threats from around the world, and many of them, sadly, are emerging out of Beijing today. We know this, we've seen it, and many of us in this House feel it. So this is not something that we're shying away from. The reality, however, is that there are many different ways of answering it. Now, he's raised a very important aspect on furs, and that's something that, of course, is being looked at. But he will have heard the words of the Deputy Prime Minister in this chamber only a few weeks ago, and how clearly he made himself heard.
Chris Brown.
I'm sorry, but I'm not convinced by the government's attitude on this. When the Deputy Prime Minister came to see us a few weeks ago, he didn't say anything new. He announced things about events that had happened 2 years ago, but the member himself knows of attempts by the Chinese government to undermine the work of the Foreign Affairs Committee of this House. Why are we only ever told about things that happened years ago? If we're surely to take these issues seriously, we have to have an up-to-date and present account of the activities of the Chinese state.
Minister.
The right honourable member will know very well that when there is a reason to act quickly and to draw it to the attention of the House, we do, as is the case of Christine Lee, which you will remember involved the payment of money to a certain member of this House, and the reason why we took that action was because, of course, we needed to expose it fast.
Shadow Minister Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner said last year that our policing and security services were technologically vulnerable because of their use of Chinese-made equipment, including CCTV, drones and body cameras. So, can the Minister say whether the digital asbestos of Chinese-made technology is still used in our policing and security infrastructure? Yes or no?
Minister.
My honourable friend will know very well that the work of Mr Fraser before he retired last year, or ended his mandate last year, has been absolutely fantastically important to many of us in making sure, and I approve the term digital asbestos, is got out of our institutions. This is something that's ongoing, so it's got out of the most secure sites already, but there are other areas where there is work to do, because of course there were an awful lot of sites, I'm afraid, which bought technology which would now be problematic. Of course, it's not just static sites. There is, of course, the potential that some electric vehicles could be easily turned into mobile intelligence gathering platforms by hostile states, and so it's not simply about looking at the past, but also at the future.
Question 4, sir.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, in 2023 we delivered a strong removal performance with overall returns back to pre-COVID levels. In total, 26,000 were returned, an increase of 74% at an average of 500 removed every week last year.
I'm grateful to the Minister's response. Can he update the House on how his department is prioritising the return of foreign national offenders to their home countries to keep the streets and communities of the United Kingdom safe?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, may I firstly pay tribute to my honourable friend and the work that goes on in his constituency, because as he knows, I visited Gatwick recently and saw for myself the good work of the Border Force team were doing there, and he'll be pleased to know that removals of foreign national offenders were up last year by 27%, and that we're committed to the removal of foreign criminals and those with no right to be in the United Kingdom.
Yes, come on.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On that point, I sadly see many asylum seekers in Newport who are stuck in limbo due to this government's incompetence. However, can I draw the Minister's attention to the case of a man in Newport who lied about his name and country of origin, is a convicted sex offender who's breached the terms of his licence, and the courts want him returned home. He wants to return home and will even pay for his flight, but for some unfathomable reason, the Home Office seem incapable of allowing or authorising or allowing this, and it's been 3 years. Why?
Well, the removals were increased last year. It's interesting to note that those of the party opposite have campaigned to ensure that they're preventing the deportation of foreign criminals, including the leader of the Labour Party. Those on this side of the House are determined to see foreign criminals removed, and there was an increase in removal of 74% last year.
Minister Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Under successive Conservative governments since 2010, returns of failed asylum seekers have collapsed by 44%, and returns of foreign national offenders have fallen by almost 30% over the same period. And for all the government's tough talk, only 2% of those arriving on small boats since 2018 have been returned anywhere, yet ministers are still resisting Labour's plan for a new returns and enforcement unit to ensure the swift removal of those with no right to be here. Meanwhile, more people crossed the Channel in small boats over the weekend than will be covered in the entire first year of their failing Rwanda scheme. So will the minister stop the headline-chasing gimmicks and instead commit to setting out what his plan is for the 99% of people who are currently stuck in the asylum system who will never be sent to Rwanda?
Well, Mr Speaker, the fact of the matter is that nearly 18,000 foreign national offenders were returned between January 2019 and December 2023. The fact of the matter is members of the party opposite, including the leader of the Labour Party, have campaigned to prevent the deportation of foreign criminals, while those on this side of the House welcome an increase of 74%, an average of 500 people being removed every single week.
Andrew Weston.
Question 5, Mr Speaker.
That we now have we reached record numbers of police officers last year, in excess of 149,000, over 3,000 more than the previous peak under the last Labour government. And in terms of local policing, we achieved 67,785 as of March last year.
I think the Minister might want to group them.
Mr Speaker, I always forget that. You're quite right. 8, 15, 16 and 18, with your permission.
Okay, Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Under this government, 10,000 neighbourhood police officers have disappeared since 2015 and are yet to be replaced on the front line. Given this government's proclivity for lifting Labour's policies, could I gently encourage the Minister to adopt Labour's plan to recruit 13,000 new neighbourhood police officers, allowing for a named contactable officer in every ward in the country?
Well, the honourable member is using figures which go up to 2019. The reason he's using figures, of course, that are 5 years out of date is the numbers have gone up since then. And if you take neighbourhood policing as a whole, it's gone up from 61,083 in 2015. That's the year he mentioned. It's gone up 61,000 up to 67,785. That's an increase of 6,000. And I'm surprised he's not joining me in welcoming it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Antisocial behaviour has been a big problem in Holyhead. Almost £700,000 of UK government Safer Streets funding has been used for CCTV, improved lighting, self-defence training for local women and girls, delivering crime prevention packs and outreach work. Would the Minister join me in thanking Chief Inspector Robert Rands, PC Lisa Thomas and many others who work so hard to improve the lives of people who live and work in Holyhead?
Well, I would certainly like to join her in thanking those officers and countless thousands of others around the country who do such good work. But on ASB, in addition to the Safer Streets money that my honourable friend mentioned, we are, from the beginning of this month, funding an extra £66 million to do antisocial behaviour hotspot patrolling. Every single one of England and Wales's police forces will get that, and that will make an enormous difference to combating the scourge of ASB.
Paul Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister agree with me that getting extra officers out in our communities should be the top of the list for any PCC? Unfortunately, in Durham, we see the Labour PCC more interested in increasing her back office staff and overseeing a declining standards, with the latest Peel report showing two areas requiring improvement for the first time ever in Durham. Would he agree with me that the sooner we get an ex-beat cop like the Conservative candidate Rob Potts in place, the sooner Durham will return to being an outstanding police force?
Well, I completely agree with my honourable friend. Spending money on things like flower beds and diversity staff instead of frontline police officers is the wrong priority. And I know that former frontline officers like Rob Potts running for PCC in Durham will do a good job of getting priorities straight.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kusama Akhtar, who is from Oldham, was murdered by her estranged husband on a busy Bradford street in the middle of the day in front of their baby son. Research has repeatedly shown that regular foot patrols, especially in crime hotspots, leads to reduced offending and increased public confidence, particularly if combined with community-based prevention. Greater Manchester Police and West Yorkshire Police want to learn lessons from this tragic murder. What lessons has the Home Secretary learned about reducing neighbourhood policing and the prevalence of appalling crimes like this?
Well, this is obviously a tragic case, and we'll obviously study any findings by the IOPC very, very carefully indeed. She mentioned hotspot patrolling, and I mentioned in my last answer that the government is providing £66 million this financial year on top of the regular police funding settlement to fund hotspot patrolling, which I think may help in situations like these. But just to repeat the point I made previously about the local policing numbers since 2015 have gone up by about 6,500, and selectively quoting figures that are 5 years old does nothing to help public debate.
James Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Halesowen Police Station is under threat of closure from decisions taken by the Labour Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands. And Tom Byrne, the Conservative candidate for PCC, has said that he will stop that closure programme. So would the Minister agree with me and Tom Byrne that keeping Halesowen Police Station open is critical for community confidence and for the effectiveness of neighbourhood policing?
Minister.
Yes, I would agree very strongly. The Labour PCC's police station closure plans in the West Midlands are shocking. I note that West Midlands Police this year are getting an extra £50 million. That is a 6.8% increase, well above the rate of inflation. And I think Tom Byrne would do an excellent job making sure that maintains frontline services, which is exactly how that money should be spent.
Mary Glendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Northumbria Force has lost 1,100
officers and £148 million from its budget since 2010, and even after the uplift, Northumbria remains 427 officers short when compared to 2010 levels. Will the Minister support the call by Northumbria's PCC, Kim McGuinness, for further investigation into police resources, as clearly not all areas of the country have benefited equally from the uplift programme?
Minister.
Well, I'm pleased to tell the House that the Northumbria Force, this financial year, the year that started just a couple of weeks ago, their funding is going up by £28 million. That is a 7.6% increase, over double the rate of inflation. So the resources are there. Using those resources wisely is a matter for police and crime commissioners, and, Mr. Speaker, it tends to be Conservative police and crime commissioners who spend those resources most wisely.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oh, sorry, question 7, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, violence and abuse towards shop workers is not and will never be acceptable. Last October, the police published a retail crime action plan. The government has embraced that and enhanced it. Last week, we launched the Fighting Retail Crime Action. Amongst other measures, it includes a commitment to create a new offence of assaulting a retail worker, something the sector has been calling for.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, I met a shopkeeper in Hounslow who's been repeatedly targeted by shoplifters. The family who own the family who own the shop can't afford security guards or to lose the large amount of stock, unlike the big chains. It's welcome the government has finally backed Labour's 10-year campaign, along with Usdaw and other campaigners, to introduce a standalone offence of assault against a shop worker. But will the Minister go further and scrap the unfair £200 limit, which leaves offenders getting away with impunity?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it is still a criminal offence, irrespective of the financial value of what is taken. We have made it clear of our commitment to ensure that shopkeepers are protected and that the retail environment is safe. That is why we have put funding in place, which has put more police officers on the streets. That's why, as my right honourable friend has just mentioned, neighbourhood policing numbers are up. That's why we have committed to pursue committed the police to pursue all reasonable lines of inquiry, and that is why I'm very proud that we have put in place a specific criminal offence for assault against a retail worker.
For our high streets to thrive, people need to perceive them as safe places to be, but there's real concern that the Mayor of London is failing to get the Met to take retail crime seriously enough. So does he agree that we need a new Mayor for London, Susan Hall, to ensure we have more effective policing in our high streets?
Home Secretary.
Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, the Mayor of London has been a massive disappointment when it has come to the policing of London. It is the only police force in the country which is seeing its police numbers reducing. It has failed to meet its recruitment targets, and quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, Londoners deserve better.
Steve McCabe.
As the chair of the all-party group on retail crime, can I welcome the announcements, as I'm sure shop workers will everywhere. When will they be operationalised, and what's the monitoring process so that we can all judge it's not just words but action?
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes an important point. We are putting it through as amendments to the Criminal Justice Bill. The quicker that makes its passage through the House, the quicker we can put these specific changes in place. But we're not waiting for that. We've had conversations with police forces to make sure that there is visible policing on our high streets, that they respond to every reasonable line of inquiry, so that they send the signal to the retailers and also to potential criminals that we take this incredibly seriously and that they will respond to this important crime type.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I realise the Home Secretary may be sick of hearing from me about assaults on retail workers, but I welcome the huge and comprehensive package announced last week last week to support these people. And I would like to thank, will my right honourable friend implement these as quickly as possible so as to benefit retail workers across Stockton South and the rest of the country?
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend who has campaigned vigorously on this and has met with me on a number of occasions to go through the specifics of these proposals, working closely with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Justice, to make sure that both the policing response and, of course, the criminal response send a very clear deterrent message to those people who might be tempted to assault retail workers. It is not acceptable, and we will take action.
Minister for Iltwal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in January, the government voted down our latest attempt to introduce a standalone offence tackling violence against retail workers. This continued a pattern of years of failing to address this issue while such violence reached epidemic proportions. And last week, surprise, they U-turned on this, and an offence is now to follow. When are the government going to follow this up by stealing the other ideas they keep denying, a restoration of neighbourhood policing, and not the response officers they've been talking about, proper neighbourhood policing, which is down between 2015 and 2023, and getting rid of the £200 limit.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, those people in the House should recognise that just because a clause might have a similar sounding name does not mean it is the same. The simple truth of the matter is the clause that the opposition put forward was deficient in many ways. The clause that we have put forward into the criminal justice bill will address the issue. And when it comes to local policing, she should recognise that there has been a 6,000 uplift in local policing.
Justin Mathers.
Question number 9, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, last year we launched the Antisocial Behaviour Action Plan, backed by £160 million worth of funding. Over 100,000 hours of police and other uniformed patrols undertaken, targeting ASB hotspots, extended to every single police force in England and Wales. We've banned nitrous oxide, increased the fines for fly tipping, littering and graffiti, and we are strengthening powers to tackle antisocial behaviour through the criminal justice bill making its way through the House.
Of antisocial behaviour that really annoys my constituents is persistent cannabis smoking from people inside their own homes, particularly in blocks of flats, but not exclusively. However, when I raise this with the police, they tell me that they're not going to go into people's homes and deal with it. I don't think that's good enough. Does the Home Secretary?
Mr. Speaker, the police, and I've had this conversation with police leaders from around the country, the police should take action where there is credible reporting of criminal behaviour, and that is a conversation we will continue to have with police. People need to be safe, but also feel safe in their communities and in their homes.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my condolences to you, sir. Protesters who recently created an obnoxious stunt outside the home of the Leader of the Opposition belong in jail, as do the trust fund vandals who caused tens of thousands of pounds worth of damage outside the Ministry of Defence last week. The truth is that frontline politicians of any political hue and our military personnel are prepared to put themselves forward to serve and protect this country, a concept the vandals, of course, would know nothing about. So when it comes to this type of antisocial behaviour, will my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, look at increasing visibility at high-profile locations like those I've discussed?
Home Secretary.
My right honourable friend raises a couple of points there. Firstly, it is completely unacceptable to try and intimidate parliamentarians of whatever political hue, and I know that I will stand shoulder to shoulder with parliamentarians of whichever political party in defending parliamentarians' right to do and say what they believe to be in the best interest of their countries and their communities without fear of intimidation. That is an absolute red line, and it will be enforced. These petulant These petulant acts of vandalism in the name of protests are unacceptable. When criminal damage occurs, that will be pursued. And indeed, in the Criminal Justice Bill, we're making specific actions to take away this veneer of defence that somehow it is justified criminal behaviour because people aren't getting their way at the ballot box.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Too many residents in Nottingham South tell me that antisocial behaviour is making their lives a misery. They never see a bobby walk in the streets, and under the law-breaking Tory Police and Crime Commissioner, Nottinghamshire Police has been placed in special measures, with HMIC saying that the force is letting victims down. My constituents tell me they'll be voting for Labour's Gary Godden on the 2nd of May to rebuild neighbourhood policing and adopt a zero-tolerance approach to antisocial behaviour. They're right, aren't they?
They would be very wrong if they voted Labour expecting that would increase a policing presence. Across the country, we've seen over and over again that the best performing police areas are most typically in control of Conservative police and crime commissioners. I know the situation in Nottinghamshire very well. I've spoken directly with the police and crime commissioner, who has a clear plan of action to ensure that she continues to put police officers on the front line, something in Labour-run regions in the area, police forces in the area, have been sadly lacking.
Jonathan Gillis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Due to an increase in antisocial behaviour in the town of Tunstall, I was proud to work with local residents, over 500 of them, in order to gain the support for new CCTV, new alley gates and better street lighting through the Safer Streets funding. However, the Labour leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council told me there'll be no money for Tunstall when I met with her, and to make matters worse, has dumped some undesirables in the Sneed Arms Hotel in the town centre. It's led to further criminal activity that's blighting high street stores up and down our community. Doesn't the Home Secretary agree with me that, thank God, Ben Adams, Staffordshire's Police Fire and Crime Commissioner, was listening, and he did indeed make sure that we got that Safer Street funding, and our community is going to feel safer, and people should vote for Ben on the 2nd of May.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I can hardly put it better myself. I've recently visited the wonderful town of Stoke, seen the passion of the people, and this is a classic example of where local leadership in the hands of the Labour Party have failed people, and local leadership in the hands of Conservatives have actually defended local people.
Patrick Reading.
Mr. Speaker, number 10.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're all concerned about the plight of those living in Gaza. Currently, we're not considering establishing a separate route for Palestinians. In any humanitarian situation, the UK must consider its resettlement approach in the round rather than on a crisis-by-crisis basis.
Patrick Reading.
Mr. Speaker, it's not surprising that the Upper Tribunal found the decision to require biometric data for people from Gaza to be irrational and unreasonable, because I think most of us find that to apply to most decisions made by the Home Office. Is it not also irrational and unreasonable for the United Kingdom to offer humanitarian visas for people caught up in the conflict in Ukraine, in Syria and in Afghanistan, but to not offer humanitarian visas for people fleeing the conflict in Gaza?
Minister.
Well, I'm not going to give a running commentary on what is ongoing litigation, but what I can say, of course, is that we are supporting individuals, British nationals with dependents in Gaza, to get those individuals out of Gaza safely, working in collaboration with Foreign Office colleagues. There are also marked differences at play here. Of course, the right of return is fundamental as part of efforts towards a two-state solution, as well as other factors that are at play in relation to the Ukrainian response. For example, the dynamic is very different, and that affects directly the relationship we have with the Ukrainian government, particularly about being able to carry out checks on individuals.
SNP spokesperson Alison Phillips.
Gaza Families United petition for a Palestinian family visa scheme has garnered now 100,000 signatures, and I hope will soon be debated in Parliament. Because Gazans are stuck in a cruel and irrational catch-22 situation. They can't cross the border to Egypt because they don't have a visa, because they can't get biometrics registered, but they can't get biometrics registered because they can't get to a visa application centre in Egypt. The government has the power to waive the requirement for these biometrics to be registered. It is in his hands to do so. Why won't he?
Minister.
She will appreciate that the security of the system is of imperative importance, we must act in accordance with those requirements. We do put that front and centre. I'm not going to comment on what is ongoing litigation, but what I can say is that we will continue to work with Foreign Office colleagues in the way that we've described. The elements of the peace process are at play in relation to these issues as well, but we will keep our response to this crisis under review as matters develop.
Sir Desmond Swade.
11, sir.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to group questions 11 and 12. The Home Office has been clear that use of hotels is a temporary and short-term measure to ensure we meet our statutory obligation to accommodate destitute asylum seekers. We've made significant progress in closing over 100 asylum hotels up till the end of March. Our actions mean there's now over 20,000 fewer asylum seekers in hotels today compared to 6 months ago.
Sir Desmond Swade.
Does his ambition extend to closing them all?
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right that the government's ambition is to close these hotels. We have closed 100 at the end of March. We are working towards closing 150 by May. Of course, the objective is to alter the way in which people are accommodated to those more cost-effective and appropriate approaches, but fundamentally to also reduce the flow of people coming to this country illegally, which is the very best way of alleviating those pressures.
Sir David Evans.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I welcome all the efforts my honourable friend is making to deal with and to speed up the asylum process. However, can he outline what measures he is considering when deciding which hotels to close in each tranche going forward?
My right honourable friend will recognise that value for money is obviously a very critical consideration that informs hotel closure decisions, but also operational deliverability, the notice periods on contracts, but also recognising the needs in particular locations and some of the challenges that these sites present. We've got a plan. We are closing hotels, and we're going to continue to deliver on precisely what we promised.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Sandpiper Hotel in Chesterfield has for almost 2 years now been being used as a hotel in this way. When I've spoken to Derbyshire Refugee Support Group, they tell me not a single one of the people who stayed there has been asked to go back to their country, and in fact the vast majority of them have been approved, which undermines the government's own sense that actually all of these asylum seekers aren't entitled to be here. Actually, the government are improving the vast majority of them. So what a waste of money it is. Why does the government continue to fail in this way? And for the Minister to come there and now sort of celebrate the extraordinary usage just because it's diminishing slightly is hopeless. When will we get the Sandpiper back in public use?
Well, I thought it was interesting that a Labour insider said to the Times newspaper last week in commentary, quote, "We need a viable answer to what we do differently other than just smash the gangs. We can't currently say how we're going to tackle the demand side of the issue." They're absolutely right. I suspect we'll be waiting a very long time for the answer that goes right to the heart of the point that he raises. The honourable gentleman is saying we ought to be closing hotels, but it's only this government that has a credible plan to do just that.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, can I also, on behalf of myself and my party, pass on our condolences to you on the death of your father. We know you loved your father, and we know your father loved you. Mr Speaker, I would like to ask the Minister a question if I can. When it comes to reducing the number of asylum seekers, one of the options that I would suggest to the Minister is one that we could do, certainly in Strangford we could do it anyway, that those people that are in hotels, we have companies in my constituency who wish to employ them. We have companies who wish to give them accommodation at the same time. So if you want to help the asylum seekers in the hotels in my constituency and in my adjoining constituency, then let them get the jobs and let them get the accommodation.
Well, I'm always very willing to engage with the honourable gentleman. He will appreciate the difficulty that we have in respect of that approach is the pull factor that would present, encouraging people to potentially make dangerous journeys via small boats to get to the UK. We do not want to do anything that plays into the business model of the evil criminal gangs responsible for that miserable trade. What we want to do is put them out of business. But on the wider accommodation point, I'm very happy to engage with him.
Sir Simon Clark.
Speaker,
In 2016, Middlesbrough had the highest ratio of asylum seekers per head of population of anywhere in England, and I welcome the closure of hotels, but I worry about reports in today's Daily Mail that the Home Office is now buying up large amounts of property in some of the poorer areas of England, which risks taking us back to the situation we saw in 2016. Will the Minister reassure me that this isn't the case? Because my constituents are clear that this places an unacceptable strain on the community and indeed an unhappy strain on community cohesion.
Minister. My right honourable friend is a strong supporter of the work that the government is doing to get a better grip on the flow of people coming across to our country who inevitably need accommodating whilst they're here. We have a mixture of accommodation to meet those needs. Getting the numbers down is critical to be able to reduce that dependence. What I am able to say, however, is that we are not actively pursuing procurement in the free local authorities cited in the article that he references, and that includes Middlesbrough.
Mike Ainsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and sincere condolences. The government promised some considerable time ago that a hotel used in my constituency would no longer be used in my constituency to house those seeking asylum. It's not the case. It's almost become de facto permanent. Could the Minister speak to me, not necessarily on the floor of the House, but separately, and give me assurance that there'll be a managed closure of that facility?
Minister.
What I can't do on the floor of the House is to make commitments about specific hotels, but I'd be very happy to meet with him to discuss this. What he could do to help me with this particular challenge is to get behind the work that the government is doing to help reduce the flow of people coming to the UK that fundamentally and crucially would help us to be able to close hotels such as the one in his constituency.
We now come to topicals. Sir John Whittingdale.
Number one, sir.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we have increased the volume of asylum processing cases. We've successfully met ministerial commitment to close over 50 asylum-seeking hotels by January 2024, and we have closed over 100 by the end of March. Last year, I brought forward measures to make legal migration fairer, radically reduce the numbers. 300,000 people who came to the UK last year would not be now eligible to do so. Anyone who wants to bring a family from abroad must be able to support them comfortably financially. And in the budget, the government put forward £75 million to roll out violence reduction units and hotspot policing across the across England and Wales, and £230 million for technology that will save the police time and money and make sure that police officers are on the front line doing the job they were recruited to do.
Sir John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I add my own condolences? My right friend will be aware that police numbers in Essex are now at record levels and that overall crime is down. However, there has been a rise in vehicle theft. Will my right friend therefore welcome the efforts of our excellent Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner Roger Hurst in establishing a Stolen Vehicles Intelligence Unit, which has so far recovered £14 million worth of vehicles? And will he look at what further support can be given to him to tackle this crime?
My right honourable friend is right to highlight the fantastic work of Roger Hurst and the Stolen Vehicle Intelligence Unit. There have been a number of large-scale seizures of vehicles being attempted to be exported. This government has reduced vehicle-related crime by 39% since 2010. Through the Criminal Justice Bill, we seek to go further. But innovative approaches, like the one put forward by Roger Hurst, is exactly what we want to see more of, and that is why I am very proud to campaign alongside him, because he has done fantastic work protecting the people of Essex.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I remember the kindness your father showed me in our long discussions on rugby league, and add my condolences too. And 35 years ago to the hour was the Hillsborough tragedy, and we remember the 97 who were lost and support the family's campaign for a Hillsborough law. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, we strongly condemn the attack by Iran on Israel this weekend, and we must do everything we can to prevent further escalation in the Middle East. But there are also domestic security issues over Iran. The Iran International journalist Puriya Zarati was attacked on the streets of London a few weeks ago, following repeated Iran-related security threats on British soil, including threats to kidnap and to kill. Does the Home Secretary believe it is now time to prescribe the IRGC in the UK?
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable lady will know that we keep our response to Iran consistently under review, and of course we have done so in the light of the attacks in Wimbledon. But she will also know that we do not speculate about future designations or sanctions, but she will also know the IRGC is sanctioned in its entirety. A number of members of the IRGC are sanctioned as individuals. As she knows, we will keep this constantly under review.
Beck Cooper.
The Home Secretary will know we have raised this many times, and I understand the complexity of the issue. The prescribing legislation was drawn up over 20 years ago to address then terrorist threats like Al-Qaeda, rather than state-sponsored threats where there might be both domestic and international security objectives. But our bottom line must be keeping this country safe, and that's why Labour has proposed new security legislation to allow the government to put appropriately targeted prescription-style restrictions on the operations of state-linked organisations like the IRGC. The government previously resisted this, but will he look at this again in the light of recent events and work with us on any legislation needed to keep this country safe?
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we have the National Security Act, and we have a range of tools at our disposal. Our defence against state threats is a priority. It's one of the priorities of the Department, and my right honourable friend, the Security Minister, leads on the practical implementation of that. I can reassure her and the House that we constantly review the range of options at our disposal. We deploy those that are the most appropriate. The protection of the UK and the people living and working within it against state threats will always be a priority of this government.
Philip Alderbill.
Will my right honourable friend, the Minister for Crime and Policing, support the excellent initiative of a number of Conservative police and crime commissioners to include filling in potholes as part of the community payback initiative for convicted offenders? And will he apply pressure on the Ministry of Justice to get this up and running as soon as possible?
Well, I think my honourable friend, the member for Kettering, has raised an excellent idea. It has my enthusiastic support, and I will most certainly do exactly as he asks straight away.
Sir Adai.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my condolences to you. The former Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration recently produced a report that stated 275 certificates of sponsorship were granted to a company that used forged documents purporting to be a real care home. Clearly, failures like this from the Home Office leave people at risk of exploitation and modern slavery. So what steps is the Minister taking to make the system more robust and to protect vulnerable people who come here to work in our care system?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady for that question, and we responded within the 8-week deadline to that ICIBI report. We accepted the recommendations that were posed to us in it. We are working through those recommendations, but there was already work in train, particularly working in collaboration with the Care Quality Commission to have better accreditation practices around care providers when we're matching people to those visas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Outdated laws are allowing child sexual predators and offenders to enter or leave our country whilst in possession of illegal material on their digital devices because the Border Force do not have the power to access them. Would my right honourable friend work with his colleagues in the Ministry of Justice to consider the merits of a new offence of wilful obstruction under which an individual could be prosecuted if they fail to unlock their devices so they can be properly searched?
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable lady for her work in this area. The issues she raises are of direct importance to intelligence gathering and child protection. My officials have been working closely with Border Force to ensure that their powers keep pace with the digital age. When the next legislative opportunity arises, if not before, we will carefully consider Border Force powers to compel individuals to submit to searches of their devices if they're suspected of holding child sexual abuse material.
David Perkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The murder of Gracie Spinks in Chesterfield sent shockwaves through the town, and the report into Derbyshire Police's handling of that was a very salutary and desperately unhappy situation. There is still far too much inconsistency into how stalking and violence against women is handled. So will the Home Secretary back Labour's plan to bring in mandatory national standards and mandatory training on violence against women so that we see consistency on stalking policing right across the country?
Mr Speaker, I can reassure the honourable gentleman and the House that under my leadership, the Home Office and policing across the UK will maintain its focus on preventing violence against women and girls. We do have a rollout of guidance and training for the policing of women and girls. I will take his proposals. I will listen carefully to the proposals he's put forward, because we want to make sure that women and girls in the country feel safe.
Government champions fantastic animal welfare standards. My constituents would like to see alternatives to animal testing wherever possible, and would be keen to hear a vital update from the department.
Minister.
Well, given the interest will be about to switch in this House to a different matter, I'll be very brief and promise to write to her, but she should know that this government has already doubled the spending on finding alternatives to animal testing, and will continue to make sure that the inspection regime is as strict as possible to make sure that when animals need to be used, the conditions are as humane as possible.
Mr Madders.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Home Secretary tell us the level of auditing that will take place in relation to the hundreds of millions of pounds being sent to Rwanda? And in particular, can he guarantee that no UK taxpayers' cash will either directly or indirectly be used to fund the M23 militia in the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Mr Speaker, all our overseas expenditure, whether it's through official development assistance or whether it is through contractual relationships we have, like the ones with Rwanda, are always robustly policed to ensure that they are spent exclusively on the issues that they are designed to do. We have a very, very strong and good working relationship with the government of Rwanda, who are absolutely committed to be the exporter of solutions to global problems rather than the exporter of problems.
Andrew Rosenberg.
Mr Speaker, sir, the people of Romford are angry. They're not getting the police cover from the Mayor of London that we pay for. We're seeing a crime wave across Romford, in Gideon Park, a stabbing in the town centre. We have had enough. Will the Minister please ensure that there is reform so that Essex towns like Romford actually get the service that Roger Hurst gives to the people of the historic county?
Well, he is quite right to draw the contrast between the excellent work done by Roger Hurst in Essex with the appalling job being done by Sadiq Khan in London. Sadiq Khan is the only one of the 43 police and crime commissioners to have missed his recruitment targets, and tragically, police officer numbers in London are falling by contrast to the rest of the country. Londoners will have a chance to cast their vote on May the 2nd, and I hope they kick him out.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituent, Maisara, is a British citizen and his parents live in Gaza. His parents successfully applied for visas to visit him in autumn last year, but they were unable to travel after October the 7th and their visas expired. I contacted the Home Office on Maisara's behalf to ask if these visas could be extended, and I was told they would have to make new applications. There are, however, of course, no functioning visa application centres in Gaza, so can the Minister explain what exactly my constituent's parents should do?
Home Secretary.
Mr Speaker, I'm more than happy to look at the details of the case. Of course, he has to understand that just as the circumstances on the ground changed dramatically after Hamas's brutal mass murder rampage on the 7th of October, our posture and our security posture to that reason has got understandably to be enhanced. This is not me making any implications about his constituents' family, but he and the House will understand that we must be careful in everything we do when it comes to accepting people who are leaving Gaza in these circumstances.
That completes Home Office questions. We now come to the statement. I now call the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, before I start, I'd like to express my deepest sympathy, and I'm sure that of the whole House, on the death of your father. He was a true giant, not just of this House, but of the other place too. I also want to express my solidarity with our Australian friends after the horrific and senseless attacks in Sydney in recent days. Our thoughts are with all those affected. Mr. Speaker, on Saturday evening, Iran sought to plunge the Middle East into a new crisis. They launched a barrage of missiles and attack drones over Iraq and Jordan and towards Israel. The scale of the attack and the fact that it was targeted directly at Israel are without precedent. It was a reckless and dangerous escalation. If it had succeeded, the fallout for regional security and the toll on Israeli citizens would have been catastrophic. But, Mr. Speaker, it did not succeed. In support of Israel's own defensive action, the United Kingdom joined a US-led international effort, along with France and partners in the region, which intercepted almost all of the missiles, saving lives in Israel and its neighbours. We sent additional RAF Typhoons to the region as part of our existing operations against Daesh in Iraq and Syria. And I can confirm our forces destroyed a number of Iranian drones. We also provided important intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance support for our partners. Mr. Speaker, our pilots put themselves in harm's way to protect the innocent and preserve peace and stability. I spoke to the RAF earlier today. They are the best of the best, and I know the whole House will join me in expressing our gratitude. Mr. Speaker, with this attack, Iran has once again shown its true colours. They are intent on sowing chaos in their own backyard, on further destabilising the Middle East. Our aim is to support stability and security, because it is right for the region, and because, although the Middle East is thousands of miles away, it has a direct effect on our security and prosperity at home. So we are working urgently with our allies to de-escalate the situation and prevent further bloodshed. We want to see calmer heads prevail, and we are directing all our diplomatic efforts to that end. Yesterday, I spoke to my fellow G7 leaders. We are united in our condemnation of this attack. We discussed further potential diplomatic measures, which we will be working together to coordinate in the coming days. I will also shortly be speaking to Prime Minister Netanyahu to express our solidarity with Israel in the face of this attack and to discuss how we can prevent further escalation. All sides must show restraint. Mr. Speaker, our action reflects our wider strategy in the Middle East, which I have set out in this House previously. I believe there are three vital steps to put the region onto a better path. First, we must uphold regional security against hostile actors, including in the Red Sea, and we must ensure Israel's security. That is non-negotiable. It is a fundamental condition for peace in the region. In the face of threats like we saw this weekend, Israel has our full support. Second, we must invest more deeply in the two-state solution. That is what we have been doing over the past 6 months, including working closely with the Palestinian Authority, so that when the time comes, they can provide more effective governance for Gaza and the West Bank. Mr. Speaker, it is significant that other regional partners actually helped to prevent a much worse attack over the weekend. It reminds us how important the attempts to normalise relations between Israel and its neighbours really are, and it holds out precious hope for the region. Third, Mr. Speaker, the conflict in Gaza must end. Hamas, which is backed by Iran, started this war. They wanted not just to kill and murder, but to destabilise the whole region. This weekend, they rejected the latest hostage deal, which offered a road to a ceasefire. It is Israel's right, and indeed its duty, to defeat the threat from Hamas terrorists and defend its security. And I want to be clear, nothing that has happened over the last 48 hours affects our position on Gaza. The appalling toll on civilians continues to grow, the hunger, the desperation, the loss of life on an awful scale. The whole country wants to see an end to the bloodshed and to see more humanitarian support going in. The recent increase in aid flows is positive, but it is still not enough. We need to see new crossings open for longer to get in vital supplies. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the 3 British aid workers who were killed in Gaza: John Chapman, James Kirby, and James Henderson. They were heroes. The children of Gaza, who they were risking their lives to feed, need a humanitarian pause immediately, leading to a long-term sustainable ceasefire. That is the fastest way to get hostages out and aid in, and to stop the fighting. Israelis and Palestinians alike deserve to live in peace, dignity, and security, and so do people across the entire region. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, Saturday's attack was the act not of a people, but of a despotic regime. And it is emblematic of the dangers that we face today. The links between such regimes are growing. Tel Aviv was not the only target of Iranian drones on Saturday. Putin was also launching them at Kyiv and Kharkiv. And who was the sole voice speaking up for Iran yesterday, seeking to justify their actions? Russia. The threats to stability are growing, not just in the Middle East, but everywhere. And we are meeting those threats time after time, with British forces at the forefront. It's why our pilots were in action this weekend. It's why they have been policing the skies above Iraq and Syria for a decade. It's why our sailors are defending the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea against the reckless attacks of the Iran-backed Houthi militia. It's why our soldiers are on the ground in Kosovo, Estonia, Poland, and more. And it's why we have led the way in backing Ukraine and will continue to back them for as long as it takes. When adversaries like Russia or Iran threaten peace and prosperity, we will always stand in their way, ready to defend our values and our interests, shoulder to shoulder with our friends and our allies. And I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for advance copy of his statement and for the regular briefings on the developing situation in the Middle East. I also thank the Prime Minister for his warm tribute to your father, Mr. Speaker, Doug Hoyle, a great servant of our party, respected by all who knew him. I also join the Prime Minister in offering our solidarity with the victims of the horrific attack in Sydney, and in recognising the heroism of the 3 British aid workers killed in Gaza while working for World Kitchen. Turning to the events of this weekend, we support the defensive action taken by the UK over the weekend, alongside our international allies, against the Iranian attacks on Israel. And we welcome the Prime Minister's call for restraint. Once again, we all salute the professionalism and bravery of our armed forces. We also support the RAF planes being sent to the region to bolster Operation Shader. Their efforts are vital for a safer world. Mr. Speaker, there can be no doubt that the attack perpetrated by Iranian forces this weekend has left the world a more dangerous place. It targeted innocent civilians with a clear intent to destabilise the region. It must be wholly condemned by all. But, Mr. Speaker, let us also be clear. A full-scale conflict in the Middle East is in no one's interests. It is a path that can only lead to more bloodshed, more instability, and the unleashing of forces that are beyond the ability of anyone to control. Mr. Speaker, the combined defensive action this weekend was a success, and because of that, lives were saved. As a result, escalation is not inevitable. In repelling the attack, Israel showed strength and courage. It must now show the same strength and courage to de-escalate. That has to be the primary objective.
And, Mr. Speaker, that is the responsibility of all sides and every partner. We must be resolute and united in our support for the collective security of Israel, Jordan and other partners in the region. But tensions remain very high. We must proceed calmly, carefully and with restraint. Because if diplomacy takes centre stage, and it must, then we also need to be clear, diplomatic premises should not be targeted and attacked. That is a point of principle. But as the condemnation from our G7 allies rightly notes, Iran's response this weekend was unprecedented, a further step towards the destabilisation of the region and the risk of escalation. And nobody in this House should be or is under any illusion. This is a regime that sponsors terror across the Middle East and beyond, that murders and represses its own people and supports Putin's war efforts in Ukraine. So can the Prime Minister update the House on any new steps he's taking with our international partners to pursue sanctions against the regime? And can he clarify what steps he's taking to limit the power of the Revolutionary Guard to glorify terrorism here in the UK? Mr. Speaker, whilst there is no justification for Iran's actions, we cannot be naive to the fact that one of the drivers of tension in the region is the ongoing war in Gaza. 6 months on from the horrific Hamas terror attack, hostages remain separated from their families. Thousands of innocent Palestinians have been killed. And now more than 1 million people face the imminent threat of famine. So I urge the government again to use every ounce of diplomatic leverage that we have to make sure aid to Gaza is unimpeded and drastically scaled up. Alongside that, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire, for Hamas to release hostages, and for a return to a diplomatic process that can rekindle the hope of a two-state solution. Mr. Speaker, it is right that we condemn Iran's action. It is right that we work with others to defend the security of our allies. And it is right that we seek the end of conflict in Gaza. But this is a moment for restraint, because escalation will only lead to further destruction. And for the sake of all those still caught in the horror and violence, that must be avoided. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister. Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his support of the government's actions. With regard to what might happen going forward, ultimately Israel has a right to self-defence, as any state does, and the G7 leaders spoke yesterday and unequivocally condemned Iran's attack and expressed full solidarity and support to Israel and its people. But as the Foreign Secretary said this morning, this is a time to be smart as well as tough. Israel has incredibly successfully repelled the Iranian attack, and Iran is even more isolated on the world stage. And as others have said, we would urge them to take the win at this point. We want to avoid further escalation and bloodshed. He's right that it would be deeply destabilising for the region and risks more lives, and all our diplomatics at this point will be geared towards that goal in partnership with our allies. Next, just turning to Iran. The behaviour of the Iranian regime, as I've said previously, including the actions of the IRGC, poses a significant threat to the safety and security of the UK and our allies. And yesterday at the G7, we agreed to work together on further measures to counter the Iranian regime and its proxies. It was agreed that we should coordinate those actions, and that work is now underway. And obviously at the appropriate time, either I or ministers will update the House. We have already sanctioned, as he will know, over 400 Iranian individuals, including the IRGC in its entirety. We have a new sanctions regime to enable us to, gives us more extensive powers to designate sanctions that we put in place at the end of last year. And of course, the National Security Act, it creates new offences for espionage and foreign interference, and means that our security services have the powers that they need to deter, disrupt and detect threats of a more modern nature from states like Iran. And lastly, with regard to diplomacy for Israel and the region, we're absolutely committed to a two-state solution and working very hard, using all our efforts to bring that about, particularly over the last few months, building up the capability, as I said, of the Palestinian Authority so that they have the technical and administrative capability that is necessary when the moment comes for them to provide effective governance in the West Bank and Gaza. It is absolutely my view and the government's view that Israelis and Palestinians should have the opportunity to live side by side in peace, with security, dignity and opportunity, and I'm proud of the role that the United Kingdom is playing.
Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Cairns.
Mr. Speaker, my condolences on the loss of your father. This remains a very dangerous moment, and yet over the weekend we saw a demonstration of unity and purpose. We saw the depth of will for normalisation and for a secure future for all peoples of the Middle East. Restraint is vital if we want to build on the momentum, to get hostages home to their families, to get improvements to continue on aid. But to better protect our people, will my right honourable friend commit to launch a new consensus on Iran with our allies and a new effort with a combined diplomatic, military and wider experts areas to limit the extent of the atrocities of Iran? We need to end the compartmentalisation of the threats when we deal with them. We must deal with them as one, whether it be nuclear ambitions, the arming of the militia, femicide or transnational repression. But only with a new consensus will we see that progress. So will he please commit to leading that internationally?
Mr. Speaker, I can give the Honourable Lady that commitment, and that is exactly the subject of our discussions yesterday amongst G7 leaders. And she mentioned nuclear. Iran's nuclear programme has never been more advanced than it is today and threatens international peace and security. And there is absolutely no justification for this, at a civilian level, for the enrichment that we are seeing that the IAEA has reported in Iran, and I want to reassure her that we are considering next steps on the nuclear file with our international partners, and we are committed to using all diplomatic tools available to ensure that Iran never develops a nuclear weapon, including using the snapback mechanism if necessary.
SNP spokesperson Murray Black.
I want to echo the Prime Minister and not only passing on our thoughts to you, Mr Speaker, but also to the families of those aid workers who have been killed in Gaza. Now, I want to begin by condemning the acts of violence by the Iranian regime. These acts are no more than a cynical attempt to exploit the suffering, the pain and the turmoil being experienced by those people in Palestine right now. And whilst we rightly condemn the violent acts of Iran, so too must we condemn the violent acts of Israel. Listening to the interviews that he's been given, the Foreign Secretary is correct in his attempt to uphold the principle of proportionality. But if 100 missiles in retaliation to an isolated attack on an embassy is correctly constitutes as disproportionate, then so too must Israel's 192 days bombardment of Gaza. Now, we know that the agenda in Tehran is to bring about as much instability as possible. We all have a responsibility to ensure that that does not happen. There is not going to be a military solution to the conflict in the Middle East. There must be a political and diplomatic solution. So what is required now is the same as what was required 6 months ago. We need de-escalating and the causes of conflict in the region to be reviewed. Now, the biggest continuing cause of conflict is the siege of Gaza, hence the need for a ceasefire. So can the Prime Minister outline what he is doing to ensure that the UN Security Council mandated ceasefire becomes a reality?
Mr. Speaker, I think first of all it's important not to try and draw any equivalence between Israel's absolute right, indeed duty, to provide security for its citizens in the face of an appalling terrorist atrocity, and indeed what happened over the weekend. These things are just not remotely the same. So we will more broadly, though, as I've said repeatedly from this dispatch box, urge Israel to abide by international humanitarian law. We've been very clear that too many civilians have been killed, and we're deeply concerned about the impact on the civilian population in Gaza, and our diplomatic efforts are geared towards alleviating that suffering, and I'll continue to raise these points with Prime Minister Netanyahu when I speak to him. But as I said, drawing equivalence between these two things is absolutely the not right thing to do.
Absolutely. Of the Defence Select Committee, Jeremy.
Notwithstanding the sheer scale of the Iranian attack, multi-layered air defence proved effective. Are we ensuring that any learnings we picked up we're passing on to Ukraine for the use of their own defence? And in a more hostile and dangerous world, and with the ever-increasing proliferation of missile and drone technology, are we reviewing our own air defence assets and capabilities to support our allies and indeed closer to home if ever required?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for an excellent question. He's right about the importance of air defence, which is why it has repeatedly been one of the key capabilities that we have sought to provide to Ukraine, something that we have led on for some time, and ditto with some of the new contracts that we've placed most recently this year to replenish UK stockpiles, also cover air defence missiles. He's more broadly right that we need to ensure that our industrial production here in the UK is geared to produce the capabilities that we need, whether it's for our own use or for Ukraine's use, and I'm pleased to say the Defence Secretary is working with the industry to ensure that supply chain is there to meet those needs.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I send you and your family our deepest condolences on the loss of your father? And can I associate myself and my colleagues with the comments of others about the appalling murders in Sydney and the death of the aid workers in Gaza? Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement? The Liberal Democrats join him in condemning Iran's attack on Israel. This is an alarming escalation in a conflict that has already seen far too many deaths and suffering. So we support the action taken by the RAF to intercept Iranian drones as we stand up for Israel's security. Mr. Speaker, we also worry about what Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government will do next. The Prime Minister rightly says we must prevent further escalation. So does he agree that the best way to achieve that is to press all sides to agree to an immediate bilateral ceasefire in Gaza, to get the hostages home, to get the aid in, and put us on the path to a lasting peace for a two-state solution?
Mr. Speaker, we've repeatedly called for an immediate humanitarian pause so that we can get the hostages out and more aid in, and use that as the foundation to build a more lasting and sustainable ceasefire. But it is worth pointing out, which hasn't been mentioned by colleagues so far, that Hamas have yet again rejected another offer to release hostages, and it's important that we don't lose sight of that. We must have the hostages released as part of any of those conversations, and it was Hamas yet again over the weekend who have rejected the latest round of those talks.
Sir Liam Fox.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for the leadership he's shown on this issue and echo his call for the need to avoid a spiral of escalation. But we've seen a military attack by Iran on a nation which its regime believes should not exist at all. Iran has directly or indirectly engineered a war in Gaza with the aim of thwarting better relations between Arab states and Israel, especially Saudi Arabia. We now have death and destruction in Gaza in a conflict that no one can win, and where the only beneficiaries are Iran, its proxies and its allies. We've seen an Iranian journalist attacked on British soil, and we've seen an international vessel being pirated by the IRGC in international waters, another vile example of hostage-taking. So I ask my right honourable friend again, why are Iranians still operating out of Heathrow? Why are Iranian banks still operating in the City of London? When will the snapback mechanism be invoked? And what can be done to stop the export of Iranian oil to Russia and other countries, which is now keeping the regime afloat?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his leadership on this issue over a consistent period of time, and he's right to highlight the threats that Iran poses to us. I want to reassure him that on all the areas that he mentioned, active work has been undertaken by the government. As I mentioned in my statement, we discussed yesterday on the G7 call the need and benefit of coordinating further measures, perhaps including some of the things that he talked about, amongst allies in order to have maximum impact both on the regime and on the ultimate designations of any future sanctions. I'm pleased that our new sanctions regime that we implemented at the end of last year gives us extensive new powers. I'm keen to make sure we use them to good effect, but where we can coordinate those with allies, I know he'd agree with me that that would be preferable, and I can reassure him that that work is happening at pace.
Sir George Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I too pass on my condolences for the loss of your dad, Doug? I was one of those who, on many occasions, benefited from his wise advice. There is no, as the Prime Minister said, there is no moral equivalence between two sides in this, what's happening in Gaza and what happened in the attacks by Iran on Israel. It is the case, though, that Israel has made mistakes in the past and should be held to account for them. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that as things move on, the importance of neighbouring states, particularly, for example, Jordan, is going to be vital, not just in resolving the current difficulties, but also in resolving a long-term future which brings about a two-state solution?
In a word, yes, I pay tribute to the King of Jordan for the leadership role that he has played over the past several months. We are fortunate to enjoy a strong working relationship with the Jordanians, which was on display yet again over this weekend, and I commend him and his country for what they've done.
Suella Bratham.
Mr. Speaker, and please accept my condolences on the loss of your father.
Here.
2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, I was in Israel at the northern border with Lebanon. And of course, we've all seen what happened this weekend. But since October the 7th, Iran-backed Hezbollah has fired over 4,000 rockets into northern Israel, displacing over 150,000 Israeli civilians. I met some of those families. They're under siege, they've been uprooted, but they are brave and defiant in the face of terrorism and anti-Semitism. Mr. Speaker, we have known for years that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is the world's chief sponsor of terrorism,
Hear, hear.
funding and promoting terrorist plots, radicalisation and hostage-taking, both in the Middle East and at home. Mr. Speaker, we have proscribed Hamas. We have proscribed Hezbollah. Prime Minister, why don't we put the UK's... Prime Minister, why don't we put the UK's national security first by now prescribing the IRGC?
Here.
Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Lady knows, that we don't comment on any potential prescription decisions, but of course we recognise the threat from Iran and have taken measures to counter it at home and around the world. I obviously refer her to my previous answer, but I'm confident the police, security services and courts all have the tools that they need to sanction, prosecute and mitigate the threats from Iran. We've strengthened our sanctions regime recently, and including sanctioning the IRGC in its entirety.
Rushanara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the calls for a ceasefire here in our Parliament and across the international community, the war in Gaza has raged, costing 33,000 lives, as well as the 1,200 killed by Hamas attacks, and a humanitarian catastrophe that is now turning to a famine. For months, many have raised the spectre of the concern around regional escalation. Can the Prime Minister say more about precisely what conversations he's having with the leading figures in the Israeli government, as well as through various parties, to influence the Iranian regime to de-escalate as quickly as possible, given the seriousness of the crisis?
Well, both the Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary have spoken to their counterparts over the weekend, including the Foreign Secretary has spoken to the Iranian Foreign Minister specifically to urge de-escalation and condemn what happened over the weekend. I'm speaking to Prime Minister Netanyahu shortly, and I can reassure her and all members of the House that we will continue, together with our allies, to urge calm heads to prevail and de-escalation
and we think that's the right course forward. And as said, across all levels of government, that's the message that we were taking to everyone.
Ben Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is another country that is under almost constant daily bombardment by Iranian-made drones. That country is Ukraine. Some 3 years ago, I pleaded with the Israelis to help Ukraine against Russia, and they refused, even though Russia was spending $500 million in the Iranian drone program. I know the Prime Minister is speaking to the Prime Minister of Israel later today. Now that RAF pilots have quite rightly gone to the defence of Israel, could he perhaps ask that Israel now decides that it is time to help Ukraine in their hour of need, and we can see off both Russia and Iranian aggression?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for the role he's played in ensuring UK security and that of our allies over previous years. He's right, as my statement alluded to as well. The Ukrainians are suffering from Iranian drones over the same weekend that this happened. And I'm also pleased, not only will I take up his points of always with all our allies, urging them to do more to support Ukraine. I know he will have welcomed the recent announcement a few weeks ago of more support from the UK to Ukraine, specifically in the areas of uncrewed platforms on autonomous warfare, to make sure that the Ukrainians both have the ability they need to protect themselves and conduct their operations. And the majority of the 10,000 new platforms that we are delivering to the Ukrainians will have been developed in the UK, which I know is something that he was keen to ensure that we saw the benefits of here at home. I'm glad that has been realised, supporting Ukraine in their security and bolstering the British defence industry here at home.
John MacDonald.
There's consensus across the House, rightfully so, to call for restraint on the Israeli government. But we've called for restraint before. We called for restraint with regard to the attack on Gaza, yet the indiscriminate bombing took place. We called for restraint on the settlements in the West Bank, and yet the settlements have expanded. We called for a restraint so that food could be got to the children of Gaza, and yet malnutrition is killing some of them. So what action will the government take if Israel does not show restraint? Because we're in danger of the Middle East being set alight by the decisions taken by the right-wing factions within the Netanyahu cabinet.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, I missed the part of the honourable gentleman's question where he condemned Iran and Hamas for what they've done. But we will always encourage de-escalation in the region, and I'm proud of the role the UK is playing to bring that about.
Kit Malthouse.
Speaker, the Prime Minister was quite right to authorise the defence of Israel and the avoidance of violence and death. But violence has also erupted in the West Bank, as he will know over the last few days. What concrete steps can we take to protect those civilians too?
Mr. Speaker, the issue of settler violence in the West Bank is something that I have personally repeatedly raised with Prime Minister Netanyahu, as indeed have my colleagues, including the Deputy Foreign Minister, and we have joined with allies in sanctioning activity of particular individuals where it has been brought to our attention, and we will continue to ensure that the Israeli government does everything it can to reduce tensions in the West Bank. We don't think it's conducive to long-term peace in the region, and that's why I said we've taken action where we can, as well as being very explicit about our concerns with the Israeli government.
George Galloway.
Mr. Speaker, I knew your father well for a very long time. He was a fine man, and I am sincerely sorry for your loss. There was not one single word in the Prime Minister's statement of condemnation of the Israeli destruction of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which is the proximate reason for the event everyone is here in concert condemning. He was not even asked to do so by the front bench opposite. Kay Burley is the only person so far to demand that of a government minister. We have no treaty with Israel, at least not one that Parliament has been shown. And the Iranians are not likely to listen to him. When Britain occupied Iran, looted its wealth, and overthrew its one democratic socialist government in my own lifetime.
Well, Mr. Speaker, whatever may have happened a few weeks ago, it is absolutely no justification for launching more than 300 drones and missiles from one sovereign state towards Israel. It's as simple as that. And in the honourable gentleman's question, not once did he condemn that action, or indeed the actions of Hamas in the region. There is no equivalence between these things whatsoever, and to suggest otherwise is simply wrong.
Robert Holford.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his strong support for the State of Israel. Last year, as Israel and Saudi Arabia were about to strike a transformational agreement, Iran-backed Hamas carried out its massacre on October the 7th with the aim of torpedoing the chance of peace between Israel and the Arab nations. And last Saturday's drone attack by Iran, being thwarted by Israel and her allies, including Jordan, demonstrated that Arab countries can work alongside Israel after this new period of contention. So does my right honourable friend agree that this represents a new opportunity for Israel and the Arab nations to rebuild relations in the aftermath of October 7th and bring the hostages home?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. It is significant that other regional partners actually helped to prevent a much worse attack over the weekend, and it reminds us how important attempts are to normalise relations between Israel and its neighbours. It holds out precious hope for the region. It's exactly that hope that Iran and its proxies are trying to snuff out, and we should work very hard to combat that.
John Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my condolences to you and your family, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, I condemn Iran and Hamas, let me start there. But we must not lose focus on the situation in Gaza, where there is a humanitarian crisis, famine, and it's just destruction that people are seeing in front of their eyes. But if we want to ensure that the hostages come home, like the hostage that's been adopted in Brent, Noah Argameni, we must argue for a ceasefire and not a pause. Will the Prime Minister clearly state that we should be calling for an immediate ceasefire on all sides?
Mr. Speaker, it's wrong to suggest in any way that we have lost sight of what is happening in Gaza, and indeed the G7 statement yesterday referenced specifically our desire to cooperate to end the crisis in Gaza, working towards an immediate humanitarian pause where hostages can be released, aid can go in and build the conditions for a sustainable ceasefire, and crucially deliver more humanitarian assistance into the region. It's welcome that we have seen an increase in that flow over the past few days and weeks, but far more aid has to get in, and that's the pressure that we will continue to put on all partners concerned.
Sir Ian Duncan.
Mr. Speaker, my condolences. Can I commend my right honourable friend's statement? It's quite clear, as has been said already, that all roads lead back to Tehran when it comes to the terrible violence and the wars that take place in the Middle East. And every country, not just Israel, but other Arab countries, fear what Tehran is doing in their countries as well, the thing we forget about. Can I therefore know that if we know that they are committing murder at home, they've executed thousands of protesters whilst this war in Hamas has been taking place. So with all of that known, can I please ask my right honourable friend, that when he sits down with our international colleagues and looks for other things to take place with regards to restricting Iran, please, could he now consider prescribing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and to do it in a way that makes sure they can no longer foment extremism here in the United Kingdom as well?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question. As I said to him, or I said in the statement, we are urgently working with our allies to see what steps we can take together in a coordinated fashion to deter and condemn what Iran is doing. With regard to destabilising activity here in the UK, he'll know that the Charities Commission very recently have opened an investigation to a particular organisation, and we will continue to use all the powers at our disposal to make sure that people aren't fomenting hate and undermining British values here at home from abroad.
Sarah Sultan.
Mr. Speaker, I've notified the office of the member for Rutland and Melton that I would be referencing her in my question. It was recently revealed that the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee told a private fundraising event, and I quote, "The Foreign Office has received official legal advice that Israel has broken international humanitarian law, but the government has not announced it." So I have a very simple question for the Prime Minister, and if he can't answer that, if he dodges and if he deflects, our constituents will know that he is hiding the truth. Was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee telling the truth, yes or no?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to address this very clearly. We have one of the most robust arms export licensing control regimes in the entire world. We have previously assessed that Israel is committed and capable of complying with IHL, but we regularly review our assessment, as she would expect. As the Foreign Secretary confirmed last week, the UK position on export licences is unchanged, and following the latest assessment is in line with our legal advice. We will keep that position under review and act in accordance with advice. And I would also point out to her that actually most like-minded countries have not suspended their existing arms export licences to Israel.
Mr. Speaker, I too welcome the Prime Minister's leadership in this area. Will he add his thanks, in addition to the thanks for the RAF who have undertaken exemplary action this weekend, also those US service personnel who are based here in the United Kingdom, including many in my West Suffolk constituency, who were prepared to act at a moment's notice in order to defend the attack on Israel, which has been roundly condemned?
Well, I'm happy to join my honourable friend in paying tribute to our colleagues, not just in America, but from partners around the region who participated in a joint international effort. This was all in support of Israel's own actions, and also their armed forces deserve enormous praise for the success in which they repelled this awful attack.
Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I pass my condolences to you and your family for the sad loss of your father, Doug? We live in deeply unsettling times, and the Prime Minister is right, along with our allies, to call for a de-escalation. When the Prime Minister has these discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu this afternoon, can he convey to him that now is the time to step back? There must be no further escalation in the Middle East. And, Mr. Speaker, now is the time to recognise that both Israelis and Palestinians must live in peace. And in order to do that, we need that two-state solution. But as the former Prime Minister David Cameron said in 2014, when we had an outbreak of violence in Gaza, he then unequivocally called for a ceasefire. We must now, today, put an end to the conflict and the killing in that region for the benefit of both these countries. And finally, if I may say so, I welcome the comments of the Prime Minister on the situation in Ukraine. But we're all aware of the reports of the build-up of Russian activity. And I ask the Prime Minister, with our allies, that we must do more today to protect our friends in Iran, to give them the tools that they need, to be able to defend themselves and to be able to make sure that Russia is defeated.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to say to our honourable gentleman that we remain steadfast in our support for Ukraine, and we will not allow Putin to achieve his aim of eradicating freedom and democracy in that country. We've announced significant support. It was the first trip that I made at the beginning of this year, and have encouraged allies to do the same. And we are committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, for not only for them to win the war, but also to emerge as a strong, sovereign and free country.
Bishop, Manchester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My thoughts and condolences are with your family. The United Kingdom stands for an international rules-based system, respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity of other nations. And that is one of our key objectives with regards to Ukraine. Of course, I condemn in the fullest Iran's attack on Israel. And I have previously condemned Iran's malign behaviour in the region. The question that is on people's mind is this: what information or intelligence does the Prime Minister have with regards to what was going on in Iran's consulate in Damascus, which led to that attack by Iran? Because the international community and people around the world want to see United Kingdom applying international law consistently across the board.
Mr. Speaker, whatever happened in that situation has not been confirmed, and regardless, there can never be any justification for launching, as I said, over 300 drones and missiles towards Israel from another sovereign country, and it was right that we took action with allies to repel that attack.
Richard Beckett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My condolences to you on the loss of your father. He'll have been very, very proud of you. This is a very dangerous moment. The UN Secretary-General rightly told the Security Council last night, now is the time to defuse and de-escalate. Ordinary people in both Israel and Iran, across the whole region, indeed wider world, will pay the price if this escalates. The Secretary-General also rightly reiterated the call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, as the Security Council voted for, given the huge loss of life there. This is the first opportunity we've had to question the Prime Minister since the recent killing of British nationals in Gaza. So is the Prime Minister planning to appoint an independent advisor to scrutinise the Israeli inquiry into those deaths of British nationals in a similar way to the way Australia has done?
Mr. Speaker, I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu after that incident to express our very strong concerns about what had happened. We are carefully reviewing the initial findings of Israel's investigations into the killing of the aid workers and welcome the suspension of 2 officers as a first step. These findings must be published and followed up with an independent review to ensure the utmost transparency and accountability.
Mike Lewis.
Can I congratulate the Prime Minister for his strength defending Israel and wider peace in the Middle East? His strength in this area is world-leading. Now, this country's friend Saudi Arabia, has now said in an official statement that Iran, quote, engineered the war in Gaza, end quote, in order to destroy the progress the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was making in normalising relations with Israel. Now, that very important statement yesterday also said that Iran is a country that sponsors terrorism and it should have been stopped a long time ago. That's the Saudis saying that. So is my right honourable friend as hopeful as I am that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel, both allies of this country, will normalise their relations as soon as possible, as it looks like they were on track to do before the pogrom of the 7th of October?
Well, I had a very constructive meeting in Saudi Arabia with MBS at the end of last year, and I know how important it is to normalise relations between Israel and its neighbours, and it's clear from this weekend and indeed the comments that the honourable gentleman just made that there is momentum and a desire to see that happen, and it holds out, I believe, precious hope for the region.
Thank you, Wilson. Speaker, can I also pass our condolences from my party on to you in the loss of your dad? The UK should not either dictate or demand from Israel restrictions in how it retaliates against the Iranian regime, which has shown it's prepared to take action to back up its threats to wipe Israel out. And indeed, the political and military support which we have given is very important. But can the Prime Minister tell us what direct action can we take here in the United Kingdom to disrupt the economic interests of Iran which exists in our own country?
We've already sanctioned more than 400 Iranian individuals, Mr. Speaker, and as I said, discussing with our allies about what more we can do.
Jason McConnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the Royal Air Force personnel who are on operations over the weekend? I also join him as well the importance of de-escalating, calling for maximum restraint, and when it comes to Gaza, working towards that sustainable ceasefire, seeing a flood of aid going into Gaza now to help the humanitarian efforts there, and also we all want to see an end to the bloodshed. But can I just echo the chair of the Defence Select Committee in what we saw over the weekend, just showing the importance of investing in air defence systems to defend civilians from these hostile regimes?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Whether it's with Ukraine, where we've provided AMRAAMs and Starstreak missiles, or indeed here at home, where, as I said, we've placed new contracts at the beginning of this year to improve our air defence capability. It's a key capability that we need to invest in, and ideally we need to produce more of it here at home.
Abdul Khan.
Mr. Speaker, 12-year-old Zain Arouk miraculously survived Israel's bombing that killed most of his family in Gaza 3 months ago, but was killed this weekend by an aid airdrop when he was searching for scraps of food because the parachute didn't open. Zain and thousands of others would still be alive had allies like the UK and US pushed Israel to adhere to the UN resolution on ceasefire in Gaza, which would allow aid to reach starving children safely. So will the Prime Minister set out exactly what repercussions Israel will face for failing to abide by the UN Security Council motion?
Mr. Speaker, I've been very clear that too many civilians have already lost their lives in Gaza. The UN Security Council resolution also called for the unconditional release of the hostages, which, as he'll know, Hamas rejected at the weekend, and it's important that we focus on that at the same time as getting more aid in.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's one thing right now that would do more than anything to help end the conflict in Gaza, and that's the release of all the Israeli hostages being held by Hamas. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that no matter how well-intentioned and no matter how much we all want the conflict to end as soon as possible, simply calling for an unconditional, immediate ceasefire reduces the incentive on Hamas to do the hostage deal. So long as they feel like they're winning diplomatically, it reduces pressure on them to do the right thing.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend, and I've made the same argument from the dispatch box previously. It's absolutely crucial that as part of the immediate humanitarian pause that we are calling for, not only can we get considerably more aid into Gaza to alleviate suffering that people are experiencing, we must be able to release the hostages, and that's what we're focused on doing.
Marshall de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst globally the attention is rightly focused on Israel and Iran, and we are all in agreement that the next step has to be de-escalation, the situation in Gaza is worsening every day. More than 33,000 lives have been lost, and more than 1 million will now be facing an imminent famine. Now, the UK almost stands alone in not restoring funding to UNRWA. So can the Prime Minister tell us when he will set out a clear path for funding to resume?
Mr. Speaker, together with our allies, we're reviewing the interim findings and are discussing appropriate next steps. Many partner countries have suspended funding to UNRWA after what happened, which was shocking. But in the meantime, we are considerably increasing our own aid into the region and welcome the commitments from Israel recently to increase the flow, opening new checkpoints, the port of Ashdod, the Jordan Land Corridor, Kerem Shalom. But now we want to see those commitments followed through. We all want to see more aid getting in, and that will be a focus of our conversations with Israel.
Logan.
Mr. Speaker, just on behalf of myself and your neighbours in Bolton North East, very sorry for the loss of your father. Mr. Speaker, 90% of Iranian oil exports go to China. China's increasing importance in the region now already trades 4 times the amount than compared to the United States, the GCC countries, along with Iran. What discussions is the Prime Minister planning on having with his counterpart Xi Jinping and the Foreign Secretary Wang Yi in terms of resolving an escalation in the conflict in Iran?
The Foreign Secretary recently spoke to his counterpart at exactly that topic, and more broadly, we're discussing with G7 partners and allies what further measures we can take to deal with the threat economically that Iran poses.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Much has been referred to by the Prime Minister and members opposite about the normalisation process between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The Saudi ambassador to this country on the 9th of January told Radio 4 that that normalisation process was subject to a two-state solution and a fully recognised Palestine. And so I just want to put that on the record. And I want to remind the Prime Minister, support for any nation is not like the unconditional support that he has for his football team. When Iran acts like a rogue state in Syria, we call them out, rightfully so. When Israel taunts Iran by bombing their consulate building, knowing full well Iran will respond, risking further escalation, we must also call out Israel. What is the Prime Minister doing in his efforts to make sure that two-state solution and the recognition of Palestine is being actively pursued?
Refer the Honourable Lady to my statement where I made clear my commitment to a two-state solution and our diplomatic efforts to help bring that about.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend has made it clear that it is right and lawful to defend yourself and right and lawful for your allies to help defend you. But would he agree that it's also important to say that self-defence can be both effective and restrained, and more than that, that self-defence can be more effective in the long run when restrained, because it helps to retain the broadest coalition of those who support your position, and because it enables you to retain the moral authority to act robustly against others when you need to?
Well, I think my honourable friend put it well. Ultimately, Israel does have a right to self-defence, as any state does, but they have successfully repelled the Iranian attack, and Iran is even more isolated on the world stage, which is why, as the Foreign Secretary said, we would urge them to take the win and avoid further escalation at this moment.
Sir Chris Bryan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister is right to say that we and our allies need to be very clear-sighted about the activities of Iran and Russia. But when you consider that there are British businesses like Avon still doing business in Russia and claiming that that is because it's absolutely vital and urgent, when you consider that there is a massive shadow fleet of tankers evading Russian oil sanctions, and when you consider that many countries are importing, such as in Kazakhstan, so that they can then import into Russia, again to avoid sanctions, and when you consider that not a penny has yet gone from the sale of Abramovich's Chelsea to Ukraine, and we still haven't seized any of the multi-billion pounds of Russian state assets sitting in British banks, isn't there further that we could go?
Mr. Speaker, we and our G7 partners have repeatedly underscored that Russia's obligations under international law are clear, and they must pay for the damage that they've caused to Ukraine. I believe we should be bold and pursue all routes through which immobilised Russian sovereign assets can be used to support Ukraine, in line, of course, with international law. This is something I've discussed with my G7 partners repeatedly. We've tasked finance ministers to that end, and they are reporting back ahead of the G7 summit in June, and I hope we can make further progress.
Sir Simon Clarke.
Deputy Speaker, and I would add my voice to those across the House who have called for the proscription of the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. Their tentacles are wherever trouble is to be found across the Middle East, and this is the latest demonstration of their malign influence. Can my right honourable friend clarify that with the threat of war growing in a way which I think bears grave risk to us here at home, that we need to set out a timetable to bring our commitment to raise the percentage of GDP that we spend on defence to 2.5% as quickly as possible, but we need specificity as to how we're going to do so?
Well, I'm pleased, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in anticipation of the rising threat environment, we significantly increased defence spending by the largest amount since the end of the Cold War just a couple of years ago, and subsequently to that by over £11 billion, specifically to deal with inflation, strengthen our nuclear enterprise and rebuild our stockpiles. But I can reassure the House and my honourable friend that we will always continue to invest in our armed forces to keep this country safe.
Joanna Cherry.
I hold no candle for the Iranian regime, and in fact I recently co-authored a report on their disgraceful oppression of women and girls, and we concluded it amounted to gender apartheid. However, just as Iran must be held to the standards of international law, so must Israel. Now, the Prime Minister has paid tribute to the brave 3 British aid workers who were killed by the IDF. Will he condemn Israel for their wrongful killing? And will he also condemn Israel for the ongoing slaughter of innocent life in Gaza?
I'll point the honourable lady to my previous answers on both her questions.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Iranian drones have not only been fired towards Israel and Ukraine, there are also bi-weekly shipments of Iranian drones arriving in Port Sudan to be used in that war, which as of today has now raged for a full year. So I'm very glad that the Prime Minister has made this statement today and is going to act first on financial sanctions and other measures. But does he agree that given that these Iranian weapons are now being used in wars in the Middle East, in Europe and in Africa, partners not only in the West but also in the global South should be deeply worried about how far the tentacles of terror from Tehran are now reaching?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend, and that's why yesterday I discussed with G7 leaders the coordinated effort amongst allies to take further measures to stem the flow of Iran's malign influence across the world, and hopefully we can coordinate that action to tackle the precise thing that she's just mentioned.
Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I deplore the attack by the IDF on the consulate in Iraq. I further totally deplore the massive attack by Iran by launching 301 drones and missiles on Israel, knowing full well that this attack will deter from the great work that we need to do in Gaza, supporting those people who are starving, who are suffering from malnutrition, young children. We need to support them to do that. Will the Prime Minister commit to the fact that he supports no escalation in the region by any of the countries that are involved at the moment, but as he said in his statement, to concentrate on supporting young people and people that are dying in Gaza?
Prime Minister.
As I said very clearly, we've urged de-escalation and calm heads to prevail, and we continue to do everything we can to get more aid into Gaza.
Francois.
Thank you, Madam. Again on air defence, I wholly commend our RAF pilots and their superb Typhoon aircraft. But we only have 137 Typhoons. And because of budget pressures, next year the MOD plans to retire 30 of them and then sell them off, which would now be akin to selling Spitfires before the Battle of Britain. Will the Prime Minister, when he has a moment, go back to his office and place that ridiculous decision under immediate review, and at the very least put those Typhoons in a war reserve in case one day we need them for ourselves?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He'll know that obviously individual equipment